Hello, welcome to the Sustainability in Wine Country online series hosted by Cork and Fork in Logan Circle, Washington, D.C. My name is Antoinette Londejean, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. We will start with an introduction to the series, followed by our guest speaker's presentation, and end with a brief Q&A. Questions not addressed during the presentation will be answered after the event in an email summary. Over the past decade, sustainable viticulture has increasingly taken root throughout the world. Global and local markets are now seemingly flooded with sustainability standards varying by country, region, winemaker, and even vineyard. Members of our own trade and consumers alike now find themselves struggling to differentiate between authentic, ethical sustainability claims, the true meaning of organics, biodynamics, and natural, and what the future holds for sustainability standards in a landscape stressed by increased competition, land scarcity, and a changing climate. This guest-hosted series seeks to provide an overview and offer clarity around the ever-changing nature of these challenges. Consumers and trade experts are invited to connect and learn from sustainably driven viticultural organizations, seasoned winemakers, and professionals working with sustainable development certification programs and international protocols, all who find themselves at the epicenter of the sustainability movement in wine country. This series is launched in parallel to the wine sector's ongoing conversation and response to climate change legislation as it struggles to find the necessary balance between profitability, environmental protection, and social development through vitiviniculture as outlined by the OIV in 2020. Thank you for being a part of this Sustainability in Wine Country series. We hope you enjoy it. Tessa, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this presentation on the New Zealand wine climate story. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity for speaking today. So this presentation aims to give some background to our industry target of being carbon neutral by 2050, show what climate action looks like at the industry level, and most importantly, as you mentioned, Antoinette, to show what climate excellence looks like on the ground in the New Zealand wine industry. So let's get into it. New Zealand is small. We have a population of just under 5 million people. We only contribute around 0.2% of the world's carbon emissions, but our emissions per person are the 6th highest amongst industrialized countries. These countries are referred to as Annex 1 countries under UN rules. New Zealand's emissions profile is different from most of the other Annex 1 countries in that nearly half of our emissions come from the agricultural sector. And you can see that in the inner circle in this graph here. Typically, the agriculture sector constitutes only a small proportion, around 12% of gross emissions for most developed nations. So our unique carbon profile requires a unique carbon strategy. The lighter green bar that you can see here shows what our national per capita average looks like when agriculture, so that's including dairy and beef, is taken into account. We actually have the 6th highest per capita emissions for all gases. This is a really complex conversation because this isn't agricultural products that New Zealand is entirely consuming itself. Around 95% of the dairy that New Zealand produces is actually exported. And because we are a relatively clean producer of these products, if countries were to source that dairy from somewhere else, you could potentially see the global emissions from that production increase, even with transport accounted for. So for carbon alone, that is the darker green bar that you can see there. New Zealand's emissions are much lower than the average of the 41 industrialized countries. Carbon is used here as a catch-all for all greenhouse gases or GHGs, coming from pretty much everything other than agriculture. So transport, electricity, waste, manufacturing and construction sits here, and of course, horticulture or the growing of grapes for wine. However, this is the totality of our emissions based on our economy. So these are the emissions that we must take responsibility for reducing in line with those global targets. For anyone who's interested, we pulled together a whole lot of research on the food miles issue. New Zealand is a small island nation down the bottom of the globe who sends its premium products around the world because people are keen to buy them. So naturally, we field a lot of questions along the lines of how can a product be truly sustainable if it's shipped from New Zealand? And that was the question that we asked ourselves. The key message that came through the research is that distance does not simply equal a higher carbon footprint. It's not that simple. Taking a life cycle assessment approach or an LCA approach consistently demonstrates that the GHG emissions associated with bringing food and beverage to market are actually dominated by the production and packaging phase. So in this case, the growing of grapes and then getting them into bottles. The bulk of freight emissions from the global food and beverage trade is actually associated with road transport within countries as opposed to cross-border shipments. In fact, one of the biggest contributors to the GHG emissions associated with the food product on a per unit basis is car travel by the consumer driving to the store or the market and back to their home with that bottle of wine or whatever they're buying. New Zealand wine is largely shipped by sea to our international markets, which is actually 10 times more efficient as on-road truck transport. And shortly, I'll go into how our certification scheme has begun to capture the key emissions associated with the production phase of our wine. But for anyone interested in digging down a little deeper, please do take a look at those food mile resources that we put together. These are available on our website. New Zealand's lower than the OECD average for carbon emissions, and a reason New Zealand is able to produce its wine efficiently, partly reflects our high proportion of renewable electricity generated through hydro, which is water, geothermal and wind. We currently meet around 82% of our energy needs from renewable sources, and we have a national target in place to be 100% renewable by 2035. The OECD average for renewable energy rates sits at around 25%. Importantly, phasing out the last remaining use of coal is an absolute priority in this transition. The OECD average for share of coal-fired electricity generation is 23%. New Zealand is under 5%, but that still needs to go as part of this transition. Forestry in New Zealand roughly offsets 1/3 of our total national emissions. We account for emissions offset through forestry using Kyoto Protocol accounting rules. Around 40% of New Zealand is covered in forests. Under the Kyoto Protocol, all forests are accounted for, but the rules kind of differ depending on when the forest was established. In 2019, New Zealand became the first country to have enshrined in law both a zero emissions target and a requirement to set a path to get there through the passing of the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act. We just call it the Zero Carbon Act because it's a bit of a mouthful. New Zealand has actually had a Climate Change Act in place since 2002, which established our emissions trading scheme, which I'll go into in a second. This was a pretty progressive piece of work at the time. The 2002 Act also established a national GHG inventory, which means we measure and report our national emissions. And the Zero Carbon Act of 2019 also set these reduction targets. The journey to the current Act looks a little bit like this. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which you may have heard of, is a UN body set up in the 80s to assess the science around climate change. Its job is to provide governments with scientific information that they can use to develop policies on global heating. They produce these periodic reports, which now essentially state that human activities have already caused 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, which is the time that humans really started our love affair with fossil fuels. And that each incremental increase in warming will bring more extreme weather events. The Paris Agreement then came into effect in 2016 based on the science that has been presented through the years in those reports. This is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 countries at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris, which is where it gets its name from. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2, but preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to those pre-industrial levels, in order to avoid those worst case climate scenarios. To achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries have to aim to be climate neutral by 2050. Each party to the Paris Agreement needs to set these things called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, representing its highest possible ambition with regards to reduction. So then New Zealand's 2019 Zero Carbon Act translates this Paris Agreement targets into the domestic context, and it sets our NDC, which is that our net emissions, so emissions after offsetting, will be 30% below 2005 gross emissions by 2030. The New Zealand Zero Carbon Act also sets into law two domestic targets, one for carbon and one for biogenic methane from agriculture, which basically comes from cows' tummies. So it treats the gases differently. This is the first time a specific target has been set for agriculture in New Zealand. And when you think back to that graph showing how half of our emissions come from agriculture, you can see that's pretty significant. So our two domestic targets are net zero emissions for all non-agricultural GHGs, or simply carbon, by 2050. So this is where grape growing and winemaking sits. And also a 24 to 47% reduction against 2017 levels in biogenic methane by mid-century, by 2050. So in terms of our tools for getting there, the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, or the ETS, is New Zealand's key tool for meeting both international obligations under the Paris Agreement and also our 2050 target and emission budgets. The idea behind the ETS is that making businesses pay for their greenhouse gases will essentially encourage them to reduce emissions through changing their practices or investing in new technologies. For every ton of carbon that a polluter releases in a year, they have to surrender a carbon credit back to the government. The government then awards credits to forestry projects, which are sinking carbon, and those credits can then in turn be sold onto the emissions trading scheme market back to polluters. The price of each credit rises according to the basic rules of supply and demand, and polluters will decide whether they want to fork out the cash for a credit, or whether it would be more economical to stop emitting via decarbonising their business practices, essentially. Our wine growers and winemakers, along with the rest of the nation, have been participating in this scheme since around 2008. It makes things like petrol and diesel more expensive. So just by way of example, last month, the emissions trading scheme added around 11 cents onto the cost of a litre of petrol. Less than 4 months earlier, it added only 9 cents per litre onto a litre of petrol. So the cost of emitting carbon is going up, and it will continue to do so. The conversation is now underway between government and the agricultural sector to price methane under the scheme as well, which is a first. So this is the world that we find ourselves in as the wine industry. In 2019, the New Zealand Winegrowers Board set a target for our industry to be carbon neutral by 2050, in line with those global targets and our domestic targets. And that was really the time we realized we needed to pause and just take stock of what is the wine industry's place in this big climate picture? What is our role here? What are our industry hotspots that we need to start addressing immediately, not waiting years for the science to come in to take action, although that's obviously really important too. And what tools do we have to run this work without placing too onerous a burden on our grape growers and wine producers? New Zealand is particularly vulnerable to the economic and environmental impacts of climate change because we are an island country reliant on primary production and tourism for much of our economic wealth. This year, the Independent Climate Change Commission released their first report providing advice to government on a national reduction plan for 2022 to 2025. A message in this report was that land use change is expected to become a part of New Zealand's transition pathway to that low emissions economy. They identified land use change from high intensity livestock agriculture, so namely dairy farming, to horticulture, around 100,000 hectares by 2050, as presenting a scenario where our more ambitious reduction targets are met. New Zealand Winegrowers also partnered with the government research agency that owns the only accredited carbon certification program in New Zealand. They're called Toitū EnviroCare, to look into this further. Just as an aside, the word toitu is our Māori word, which encapsulates concepts such as enduring, untouched, kept pure, and protected. But I digress. We got them to look into how wine growing stacks up through the lens of climate change. Their advice was that a move to planting grapes in areas suitable for quality wine production, currently used for more emissions-intensive land, has great potential to help reduce New Zealand's emissions overall. They ran an assessment of land use, greenhouse gas emissions on the wine sector, compared with a range of other sectors in New Zealand. And they found that grape growing is a relatively low producer of emissions, both in absolute terms and importantly, per export dollar value earned. And that report is also available on our website if anybody is interested. So this research is supported by work done by the New Zealand Productivity Commission in 2018 too, which looked at tonnes of CO2 emitted per hectare of land across several industries. A similar study in 2017 by Plant and Food Research here in New Zealand found the per hectare carbon emissions of vineyards were the lowest of the New Zealand horticultural primary industries studied. They were roughly 50% lower than New Zealand kiwi fruit and apples, even when shipping was considered. So all that to say, we have a fairly good sense of our place in the big picture. We have that confidence that wine growing is very much a part of our low emissions future here in New Zealand. Our challenge now is to get our industry informed, prepared, and taking action. So let's take a look at that. This is a good point to jump into our Sustainable Winegrowing New Zealand certification program, also known as SWNZ. SWNZ is an industry-wide certification program led by New Zealand Winegrowers. It launched in the mid-90s as a program based on continuous improvement and adherence to standards which ensure members meet international guidelines for sustainability practices in the vineyard and in the winery. So 96% of New Zealand's vineyard producing area is SWNZ certified, with another 7% operating under recognised certified organic programs. Over 90% of wine produced in New Zealand is processed in SWNZ certified facilities. This level of industry-wide participation in a sustainability scheme it's a massive point of difference for wine produced in New Zealand. SWNZ certifies all parts of the production chain, from vineyard to winery to bottling facility to brand. So to be SWNZ certified, all members must complete these annual submissions and undergo regular on-site audits conducted, importantly, by independent third-party verification companies. Annual submissions are made through an online questionnaire, and they cover off impacts across our 6 focus areas, which you can see here. These are soil, water, pest and disease, waste, people, and most recently, climate change. If a question is answered showing that a vineyard or winery practice does not comply with industry best practice, a corrective action is raised, and the business has a window of time in which to remedy that issue. Wine made from grapes grown in 100% SWNZ certified vineyards and produced in 100% SWNZ certified winemaking facilities can display this logo on the bottle. This is your guarantee of sustainable production from grape to glass. So this is a really good one to look out for next time you're picking up a bottle of New Zealand wine. So just to get down into a little bit of detail, this is the most detail I'm going to throw at you, I swear. In terms of climate change component in that questionnaire, 2021 was the first time the program included an explicit section on climate change. The certification, it's not designed to be a comprehensive carbon accounting scheme. Such schemes are highly specialized, they're expensive to run and audit, and they require significant time inputs from businesses. Because SWNZ is auditing impacts across multiple focus areas, the team had to take a pragmatic approach to the inclusion of a climate section. We have a number of members around the country going through formal certification for the management of carbon, but we wanted to ensure that we're capturing at least the key sources of emissions from all of our members, regardless of the resources they have available to them. We partnered with New Zealand's leading accredited carbon certifier to ensure that while we're not providing a comprehensive carbon accounting system through SWNZ, we are structuring our questions to align as closely as possible with international best practice. In this case, that is the ISO greenhouse gas standard. So they provided advice on the industry's key greenhouse gas emissions based on their database of comprehensive carbon inventories of real vineyards and wineries. So they provided us with almost like a hypothetical vineyard and a hypothetical winery based on real life industry data. Our SWNZ questionnaire gets members to input their usage on electricity sources and consumption, transport fuels, so that includes transport fuels used to move grapes from the vineyard to the winery, waste to landfill, and also data around packaging. So regular glass in bottles versus lightweight glass, refillable bottles, etc. There's also a question on the source of the glass itself. So whether it was produced in New Zealand or if it was produced in other countries, where the energy inputs will be different and there is a distance traveled by the empty glass bottle to get to New Zealand in the first place as well. The questionnaire is also capturing the number of businesses who are engaged in carbon management and certification activities, or schemes, I should say. Industry carbon emissions will be tracked through time through our SWNZ member portal, enabling us to benchmark where we are now so that we can chart a better path to achieving our 2050 goal of carbon neutrality. As a step to demonstrating industry commitment to a low carbon future, and also to ensure the industry body ourselves understands the intricacies of the carbon certification process, New Zealand Winegrowers gained carbon reduced certification this year. So that's really exciting. This is that ISO standard for greenhouse gases. So we have our mechanism for capturing key emissions from the growing of grapes and making wine. We have an online dashboard for establishing baselines and identifying trends and reductions. There's also a lot of work going in to ensure that regardless of resources that winemakers have to invest in carbon reduction, they have access to easy to understand, relevant and pragmatic advice. And this is the reduction part of our strategy. The SWNZ team, they provide some really great information to enable members to make informed choices on reducing their emissions. One form of this information is fact sheets for how to calculate diesel use. There are also action sheets on things like energy efficiency, efficient refrigeration techniques. Outside of the SWNZ certification program itself, keeping our members informed on upcoming changes relating to the government's climate change reform agenda is a big focus for us here at New Zealand Winegrowers. Climate change education has a consistent presence at virtually all member engagement events, including one called Grape Days, which is a viticulturalist focus forum, and also our Young Viticulturalist events too. Of key importance currently and the near future is preparing our members for upcoming changes to that emissions trading scheme that I spoke about previously, and why reducing carbon just makes good business sense. Our partnership with Toitū EnviroCare saw the creation of a carbon reduction guide that is tailored for the wine industry based on those real life examples of wine industry carbon inventories. Understanding the size of different emission sources can inform the strategy for identifying areas for improvement. So the purpose of this guide is to do just that, in order for our members to take a targeted approach to reduction actions in lieu of a formal carbon inventory being undertaken by an individual business, because not everyone can afford to do that. So under each key emission source, this guide that you see here provides pragmatic reduction actions and resources for further support as well. Industry peer-to-peer learning and innovation sharing has been supported through the launch of our Sustainability Guardians program, which has a climate change working group under it. This working group provides members with an opportunity to engage with industry champions and other service providers who can assist them on a climate change mitigation journey. The first climate change webinars hosted by the program included presentations from carbon management experts and members on the carbon reduction journey, including a representative from Wineworks discussing the experience of a carbon neutral winery, bottling and warehousing provider. And you can find those webinars on our website as well, I believe. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the climate work that's gone in behind that bottle of New Zealand wine you're holding. I want to round off this presentation by giving a few examples of what climate excellence really looks like in our industry by highlighting just a few of our industry champions. First up is The Landing. This is a vineyard, winery and luxury residence on about 400 hectares of coastal habitat on the Porirua Peninsula in the beautiful Bay of Islands in northern New Zealand. Caring for the environmental landscape and honouring their cultural history are two of The Landing's guiding principles. And for anyone who is interested, I would highly recommend taking a look at their sustainability report, which is available on their website. Something that I love in their sustainability report is they list te taio, or the environment, as a key stakeholder that is considered in the formation of business objectives. I think that's the first time I've ever seen that. I thought that was really cool. Another key stakeholder is the local hapu, or sub-tribe Ngāti Torehina, and te Tai Tokoro Iwi, or tribe Ngā Pohi. So The Landing formally became a carbon zero certified organisation this year. They achieved carbon neutrality in part through growing their own carbon sink of regenerated native forest and wetlands. Their replanting, in fact, absorbs more than 3 times as much carbon as the business emits, which is pretty impressive. Vegetation on the property has been increased from 88 to 125 hectares since the property was first purchased 20 years ago. In that time, over 1.2 million trees and native plants have been planted. Last year alone, they planted over 12,000 native seedlings, which are largely sourced from their own nursery. So the image to the right here shows some of this regenerating bush nestled amongst the vineyards on their property. But you can't become carbon neutral certified without demonstrating you're making reductions against long-term targets. Offsetting alone won't do it. Through the carbon zero certification process, The Landing have a thorough understanding of their key emissions and have set specific reduction targets against each one. So these can be seen here in the graph in blue, which they include in their sustainability report. Their key emissions are those generated by transport fuels, particularly diesel, and the second largest part being generated by electricity usage. So The Landing have a target to reduce purchased diesel by 10% through efficiencies in vehicle use, ensuring right-sized equipment and the phase-in of electric vehicles, or EVs, which is going to be staged over the next 3 years. They have a target to reduce purchase electricity emissions by 15% by 2023, I believe, through on-site renewable power generation, in order to reduce dependency on backup diesel generators, which they use when there is power supply insecurities. They're already sourcing the bulk of their purchased electricity from a local Northland geothermal power supplier called Ngāwha Power, which is pictured here too. And this is a renewable source of energy. Cool. So next up is the wonderful Lawson's Dry Hills in the Marlborough region of the South Island of New Zealand. Sustainability is nothing new to Lawson's Dry Hills. Their founder, Ross Lawson, was a leader in the 2001 initiative to convert New Zealand wine companies to use screw caps rather than cork to ensure quality and reduce wastage. Lawson's Dry Hills holds ISO certifications for both environmental management and carbon zero. They were also awarded winner of the wine industry category at the 2021 Cawthron Marlborough Environment Awards. Their lightweight glass bottles are made in New Zealand with a minimum of 65% recycled content, and they've made huge reductions in water use and plastic packaging as well. But in terms of their climate actions, Lawson's Dry Hills carbon inventory revealed that freight, followed by diesel, were their largest contributor of emissions. And they have made some great inroads in reducing the freight emissions on wine for export, which accounts for around 80% of their wine. A key initiative here to reduce these emissions has been stipulating conditions when they quote their terms for freight to leave directly from the local Nelson port, which is pictured here, as opposed to first trucking the bottles by road up to Auckland, which is around 780 kilometres per truck movement. They also consolidate the movements to that port in larger B-train trucks versus numerous smaller volume movements. Diesel use has dropped through the investment in more efficient vineyard equipment, including tractors, and reducing the number of passes in the vineyard. They have also attacked refrigeration emissions through using flotation for settling wine rather than relying on refrigeration, and also through upgrades to insulation on their refrigeration lines and their tanks. As well as the reductions they have already made against the baseline carbon footprint, Lawson's Dry Hills have committed to further reduce their overall emissions by another 10% over the next 5 years. They have recently completed the installation of 200 solar panels, which are now providing 1/3 of their electricity, which is pretty impressive. And you can see some of their solar panels here behind the new vine shoot. And finally, we have 362 Wines, a boutique winery in Hawke's Bay, founded by winemaker Alice Rule. Alice is a staunch industry advocate for sustainable and circular models of production. Her label uses plastic-free packaging, New Zealand-made Forest Stewardship Alliance recycled boxes and inserts, and low-weight glass bottles. They also plant 362 trees each vintage in a Trees for Bees initiative. 362 carbon negative. They measure, reduce, and offset more than 200% of their carbon emissions. They were an early adopter of a point of sale offsetting option through a company called Carbon Click, where customers can opt to pay a small fee to offset the emissions associated with the freight part of their wine. The fees go to a verified, credible offsetting project, and customers get a tracking number to see where that money was used, which is pretty interesting. 362 very much operate with the concept of kaitiakitanga, or guardianship of the land, at the forefront of everything they do. So Alice recently undertook a research project through the Kellogg Rural Leadership Program, looking into glass packaging, which represents around 35% of our industry's footprint. Specifically, the sustainability performance of New Zealand's glass recovery infrastructure, or our glass recycling infrastructure, and how this plays a role for both consumers and producers in tackling the largest single contributor to the life cycle emissions of our wine. Alice's message around glass is that although it contributes significantly to our industry's footprint, it's circular, meaning it can be infinitely recycled without degrading in quality, and it's inert, which means in the worst case scenario, if that glass is not recycled, it will eventually break down into minerals and not cause any form of environmental degradation. And this is really significant in a world that is drowning in single-use plastic waste. Alice's call to action is around the use of lightweight bottles, which are produced locally, where we have a high percentage of recycled glass. Having bottles made with 10% more recycled materials results in a 5% reduction in emissions per bottle due to lower heating requirements and fewer raw materials being used. Every tonne of glass recycled saves approximately 670 kilos of CO2 compared to using raw materials or virgin materials. Also, the heavier the glass, the more energy that needs to be used to transport it around the world or just domestically within country. So a message that Alice is getting out there is that lightweight glass is in no way an indicator of low quality wine. It's an indicator of lower emissions. Her research showed that while glass obviously has those embodied emissions, New Zealand is pretty well advanced with respect to reducing the climate impact of glass. We're currently recycling 75%, and our Glass Packaging Forum has a goal to have 82% recycled by 2024. Finally, Alice has also put the challenge to us, the industry body, to encourage New Zealand's only glass manufacturer to continue down an emissions reduction pathway for our glass produced here, and also to improve their transparency around emissions associated with their production, so that companies going through carbon inventory exercises can improve their accuracy in their measurements. So, a big, huge thank you for having me here today. I hope that gives you all a good snapshot of the climate work that goes into producing that bottle of wine from New Zealand.
That was an amazing presentation. Before we wrap up tonight, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I think it's just around the urgency of the climate issue, and consumers, you've got a lot of choice out there, and it's really worthwhile just digging down behind some of those labels and asking questions of the producers of those products that you're buying. And one really great thing about Wine from New Zealand is you can look out for that SWNZ logo. You can look out for those other organics logos as well. And hopefully today's presentation has given you a little bit more insight of what's behind those logos.
Thank you to all for joining us. We look forward to featuring our next Sustainability in Wine Country event with Lodi Rules Sustainable Winegrowing Certification Program next week. This webinar will be hosted by Dr. Stephanie Bolton, the Sustainable Winegrowing Director for Lodi Rules. Program details may be found on our website at corkandfork.co under our calendar. Thanks again for joining us. Tessa, thank you very much. And I wish everybody a lovely evening. Take care.